there's an old joke in Cuba that whenever you ask someone, what are the great triumphs or achievements of the revolution, they would say national sovereignty, healthcare, education. And then they would say, well, what are the big problems or the failings of the revolution? And they would say breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? And so now they don't even have those first three things that they've achieved, nor do they have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so that's part of the reason why people aren't putting up with it anymore, in addition to their access to digital media that lets them shout and scream so other people can hear them.
This is the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast, Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by Ted Henken. Ted is a professor at Baruch College in New York. His research focuses on Cuba, and he is one of the editors of the book Cuba's Digital Revolution. So, Ted, thank you so much for joining me.
It's good to be with you, especially talk to your listeners. The podcast title really grabbed my attention. We certainly have electile dysfunction in this country, but there are countries where they don't even have elections to dysfunction. So it's important to remember where we are relative to a place like Cuba. So I'm happy to share my thoughts on Cuba with you guys.
Absolutely, and that's why I wanted to have you on. You are so knowledgeable about the field and have so many interesting insights. So Cuba obviously doesn't garner, I would say, the same amount of attention it used to in the past. We're talking so much about China, understandably, Russia, now Ukraine. We talk about Iran, North Korea, but Cuba's obviously played such a impactful role in the history of American politics. It's essentially for maybe 70 years dictated America's entire geopolitical strategy, right, with respect to foreign relations. You can't win the presidency without winning Florida, generally speaking. Last time was a exception, but and you can't win Florida without Cuban Americans.
Right.
So even today that topic plays a massive role in not only our foreign policy but our domestic policy as well, which is pretty interesting. And it's such a unique nation. There's nowhere like it. So last time we heard about Cuba in any meaningful way in the mainstream press was these protests, which occurred about 6-7 months ago over the summer, when protesters were taking the streets against the government, apparently largest demonstrations in generation and decades, and they were chanting libertad, they were liberty. They were also chanting this phrase, patria y vida, homeland or life, which became a rallying cry after a hugely successful Cuban anti-regime rap song went viral. So maybe walk us through the nature of these Cuban protests from a few months ago. How significant were they? What were they about? Did they die off? And where's all that stand right now in Cuba? What's the situation like?
Sure. So let me start with the point you made about Cuba's influence on the U.S. There is a Cuba that exists in our minds as Americans, as outsiders, as non-Cubans. And then there's a real Cuba that exists in Cuba. And it's always important to kind of separate those because the real Cuba, the ones that Cubans live in, is powerful and affect people's lives. And we understand Cuba really through our own domestic politics, and it's often the tail that wags the dog of presidential politics every 4 years. But you Cubans don't have the luxury of dealing with their problems once every 4 years. They've got to deal with it every day. So the protest that happened on the 11th of July, 2021 in Cuba were certainly unprecedented and were the largest protests probably, you could say, in the last 60 years since the revolution came to power in January of 1959. Wow. They were the largest in the sense that they took place all across the island and in more than 50 different cities and towns. They drew people from many different walks of life. This wasn't just a matter of political dissidents or independent artists or activists. It was something that was much more broad-based than that. And the things that they were demanding were a broad swath of things, everything from economic reform, access to medicine and food, to political regime change, essentially. And this happened on a number of days, although they certainly faded when the government took to the streets and called quote unquote revolutionaries to the street to take back the streets from the supposed mercenaries or counter-revolutionaries, right? I mean, the government and the president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, actually, the best word to use here would be sicked the supposed revolutionaries with brickbats on any protesters, along with sicking his own repressive forces on them. At the same time, he had the government shut down the internet. And so that was the kind of the 1-2 punch of physically taking back the streets, but also digitally taking back cyberspace, because the government has been caught flat-footed over the past 5 to 10 years, because activists, artists, digital millennials in Cuba have really beat the government to the punch when it comes to using the internet to speak truth to power, to demand that the government be more accountable or responsive, and to also publish a different, much more closer to reality version of life in Cuba that the government media has basically blocked out, monopolized. And so all of these things are happening at once. The protests themselves, you could say they have fundamental causes, deep causes, and then they have triggers that are kind of working together. So the fundamental deep causes, I would say, are the double existence of an unproductive, inefficient economy or economic system that doesn't incentivize work and that is monopolized by government companies or government businesses, enterprises, and has a very small and only partially legalized private sector that's constantly playing whack-a-mole with the government, combined with essentially the worst or among the worst records in terms of political freedoms and civil liberties in the whole hemisphere, on par with countries like Saudi Arabia and China and Russia, right? In terms of just fundamental liberties, kind of enshrined in kind of like the liberal democratic experiment of the last 100 years, Cuba basically erased those as part of its revolution 60 years ago, and there's been a struggle to try to regain them. I'm talking about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of association, apart from, democratic political system, right, or the lack thereof, right? So those are the fundamental causes, but the trigger causes are a combination of Trump's policies toward Cuba, which basically erased the Obama opening that took place starting in 2014. The last 2 years of the second Obama administration, there was a big opening toward Cuba and a thawing out of this icy relationship we've had. Trump basically scuttled that during his 4 years in office and strengthened the sanctions, strengthened what we call the embargo. But that was combined with two other big things. One was that after the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba turned toward Venezuela and Hugo Chavez, who was then president for various terms, strongman president of Venezuela, and they became Cuba's new sugar daddy, Cuba's new trading partner and aid partner. But that has essentially withered away, eroded under Nicolás Maduro and the civil, political, economic meltdown that took place in Venezuela. And so that also combined with the embargo has hurt the Cuban economy. And then on top of that, Cuba was really impacted by COVID, not so much at first by actual disease, although that eventually did catch up with Cuba, and Cuba had a really delayed reaction in terms of the disease spreading, people dying, etc. At first, it was actually fairly well controlled, but the disease basically, or the spread of the pandemic basically killed Cuba's international tourism industry, which is one of the fundamental pillars of its economy. I mean, Cuba went literally from a monthly average arrival of foreigners of around 200,000 to 300,000 to around 2,000 to 3,000. So it dropped like 95, 99% in terms of the international arrivals. and it had been really counting on this between 2015, 16, and 17, since Obama made it easier to travel to Cuba. So those three things really
Right.
destroyed the economy and increased what were already chronic scarcities in Cuba to medicines and to foods. And then the government, probably at the worst possible time, January 1st, 2021, so almost exactly 13 months ago, the government tried to unify its currency. They imposed a new kind of, they're trying to get their economic house in order, but what this did is it provoked uncontrolled inflation over the year of 2021. So even though people's salaries, incomes went up, the prices of everyday items went up even more, leading to scarcities, more lines, and therefore people were angry, frustrated. They couldn't get access to food and medicine during the worst part of the pandemic. And then on top of all the other things I described, it basically triggered. Now, all of this was combined with what we call in our book, right, Cuba's digital revolution, meaning that over the last 5 to 10 years, and especially since December of 2018, Cubans have gone online, have been able to access the internet and mobile technology, especially the internet on their cell phones. And this has allowed them to kind of narrate their own version of reality that basically is at odds with the government propaganda, and therefore they can communicate horizontally within Cuba, share their frustrations. A bunch of new independent newspapers and magazines have popped up in Cuba, run by Cubans, that have done real investigative reporting, exposing a lot of the problems that the government has been been hiding. And this also allowed Cubans to engage in activities that then would go viral on sites like Facebook, with Facebook Live, where they would record something happening in real time. Other people would see it. They could also organize things, months or weeks in advance, and have these real-world marches or protests. So all of those things combined. And so on July 11th, they came to a head, and people took to the streets.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as you described that, I'm instantly reminded of a situation I'm a bit more familiar with, is Iran, where you have same kind of dynamics, a young population. You have, as you were describing, people who weren't typically the protesters of before. Now you see these things springing up all over the country. Same thing with Iran, largely fueled by applications like Twitter and Signal and Telegram and all that as well, to mobilize, and then obviously the parallels with the massive repression from the top on these protesters. I think so. I read that in Cuba, 700 people were charged during these protests. At least 50 were between the ages of 16 to 18, just for protesting. Cuba's interesting as well because I want to ask you about sort of the economic situation with the currency, because it's a very peculiar situation they've had there. But before we get to that, why do you think that Cuba didn't go the way of the Chinese model or the Vietnam model? It's pretty much like the last one standing, maybe next to North Korea, where China and Vietnam, they still have the Communist Party at the top, authoritarian, but they eased up economic reforms. They, allowed for foreign investment to come in. They liberalized a lot of their trade. Why do you think Cuba didn't engage in that road, or did they try?
Well, my economist friends call that market socialism, right? And Cuba hasn't exactly right, hasn't taken that path. There have been elements of that Cuba has tried out. They have instituted things like what they call in Cuba self-employment. They just recently, just 3 or 4 months ago, finally, after lots and lots of years of kicking the can down the road, they legalized private businesses. But we'll see how that works out, because it has tons and tons of restrictions. Essentially, people who are professionals can't go into private business in their professions, right? So it creates these weird things where you have doctors driving taxi cabs because they can make more money driving a cab than they can, because
Right.
if they practice their profession, they're forced to do so within the state system that pays very little, right? They can't practice it privately in the free market, right? I actually just discussed your question about why not Vietnam, why not China as a model for Cuba to follow with some friends of mine last week. And my argument, or my idea, is that the main reason is that the Cuban government is afraid that instituting those economic reforms, when it's so close to the United States, with both the United States and the Cuban American community kind of poised to, take that opportunity to really take over the Cuban economy. I think that China and Vietnam could do that because it can control, the diaspora of the Vietnamese or the Chinese and the United States, and it can kind of partner with them and still be in control of their own economy. Whereas I think that the Cuban leadership is afraid that if it follows that market socialism model, very quickly Cuban Americans, Cuban American, investors or capitalists or
Right. Well,
whoever,
yeah, right.
and the American
good point.
economy will pounce and take over because the presence of that community and the presence of U.S. policy in Cuba is much more strong than I would say relative to the United States' role in China or in Vietnam and the role of the diaspora in those countries. You could also argue that just beyond that fear, there's also, they're happy with their monopoly and they don't mind if it is impoverishes the mass of people, as long as the people who are at the top can live insulated from that and can really be in control of, there's a kind of I always tell people that Cuba doesn't really have communism or socialism, not necessarily as a way to celebrate communism or socialism, but to kind of really analyze what's going on in Cuba is really state capitalism. They have their own version of capitalism, but it's monopolized by the government and particular entities within the government who benefit from that. Whereas the Cuban citizens, Cuban people are basically segregated from participating or benefiting from that.
The old capitalism for me, socialism for you.
Well said, yes.
That's certainly how it works. So you mentioned the bit about the taxi cab drivers. I was listening to something interesting. I have a guest next week. His name's Dominic Frisby. He's a brilliant guy. He was giving a little anecdote about when he went to Cuba. I guess when he was a young guy, 25 years ago. He was sort of a young, impressionable, maybe socialist sympathizing kind of person. And what he realized was that really disturbed him. And this was in the context of him discussing how when you have such a corrupt economic system, such a corrupt monetary system, that it starts to erode the values and morals of the people within it. And so as he was discussing, the taxi cab drivers and prostitutes, those are two professions that people were incentivized to choose, even in a lot of cases by their families, because they'd be interacting with American or European tourists. So I guess mostly European back then, particularly Italian tourists for some reason. They came a lot,
Yes.
and they would be paid in US dollars, and they would be getting more in a night or a week than a heart surgeon could get in months. And how that sort of just warps. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are, you're going to go with being a taxi driver or a prostitute over some of these other professions. A lot of people make that choice, and just how that warps the sort of human psyche and the values of society is just it's so disturbing.
Yeah, I always say that I consider myself left of center, but there's no better thing to temper or cure someone's socialist tendencies than going to a socialist country and seeing how things don't work in those socialist countries, right? Especially the socialist countries that have command economies, what we call state socialism, right? The socialism that's practiced in Cuba or in North Korea, or for that matter in Vietnam or China, is different from the socialism that exists in many European or Scandinavian countries, right? And we often in the United States overlook that very important distinction. There are versions of democratic socialism, and there are also versions of very undemocratic and very unproductive, inefficient socialisms, right? And Cuba, as you said, and as your friend pointed out in his observations, is that second version that really does distort. It has, a friend of mine in Cuba calls it, it has anthropological damage that it does on people and on a society, because it totally warps incentive structures, professional, let's say, ethics. You go to your job because you get paid, but you also go to your job in most cases because you care about it, you believe in it, you have a kind of an ethic of doing that, right? But in Cuba, those are very, very heavily challenged because you often you often actually lose money when you do your regular job, and you have to have the moonlighting job to make money on the side, and then that then warps things, and then so you have things like restaurants, cab drivers, that develop these side businesses because they're exposed to the hard currency that foreigners bring in, and then therefore they also may connect to other ways that are more illicit ways of getting that money from tourists, through things like, prostitution, um, and also just the waste of the talent.
Right, right. That's a
The
big one.
Cuban government will often accuse the United States of incentivizing a brain drain, taking all their smart people away. But I have another friend, a Cuban friend, he says, but what the Cuban government promotes is a brain waste, right? They have these really educated, brilliant people who are often frustrated and are forced to go abroad into the diaspora, into exile, to be able to practice and benefit from their profession, right? I mean, Miami.
Right, or even in their own home countries, right? I saw a program even in their own countries. I forgot which program it was. It was on um, it was on the TV news or something like that. But this guy was a doctor, and he opted to be a baker, right? So obviously being baker is great and all that, but we need the people with the aptitude for being doctors to be doctors. And so, but he went to be a baker because he could be paid in U.S. dollars, and he started this bakery, which is now catering, I guess, before the pandemic, to tourists and all that. And
Yeah.
he was making way more of a livelihood being a baker. So
Exactly.
right.
Cuba ironically pushes the professionals either into exile or into what some people call internal exile, where they have to practice something else to get by. And in addition to those two things, there's so many overeducated doctors in Cuba that the Cuban government actually exports them to other countries as a way to bring in hard currency. That's one of the three pillars of the Cuban economy is tourism, remittances sent by Cuban Americans, and the export. They call it the export of medical services, but basically it is sending Cuban doctors to countries, and it's mostly seen as a kind of humanitarian gesture, but it's all paid for in hard currency by those countries. That's then taken back to Cuba.
What do you
And
mean
the
by hard
government
currency?
dollars.
Oh, okay, dollars.
It's paid for. It's not just a humanitarian gesture. Cuban sending doctors abroad. Cuba sends doctors, and those countries pay per doctor, per medical professional, and the government of Cuba keeps 80% of that money, and the professional only gets like 15 or 20% of that money, but they only get it if they go back to Cuba. So some people have called this a form of modern exploitation or slavery, where the doctors basically are forced into this. They end up making a lot better living if they go on these international missions, and they also probably do it because they believe in the cause, but
Right.
they're also forced to do it by lack of options and lack of any private sector where they could practice their professions.
And so maybe like they'll make a couple $100 for the month rather than 30. Is it something along those
Exactly.
lines?
Exactly. Yeah.
Speaking about the currency situation, so what role does the U.S. dollar play in Cuba? Because I know they had this confusing currency situation forever, where they try to manipulate, and obscure how worthless the currency was. They had like a convertible peso, which you if you come in there, you use that if you're a tourist, and then they had their own peso, but the convertible peso was like a 1-to-1. How did that all work? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, you have to remember back to when you used to play Monopoly as a kid, right? I have a 7-year-old, and I was just teaching him Monopoly during the pandemic, and he was fascinated with the money, because for him it was a game. The money had value, right? So in Cuba, you had this kind of invention of a fake currency. What happened was, going back 25 years to 1993, the Cuban government was in a tailspin. The economy was in a free fall because the Soviet Union had collapsed. And so the Cuban government legalized the use of dollars because people were already hoarding dollars and using dollars illegally. And before that, you could actually go to jail for using foreign currency, especially dollars. But since everybody was doing it in the early 90s, they legalized it. And so at that point, they ended up having two currencies. They had their Cuban peso, which was increasingly worthless, and then they had the U.S. dollar. So what they did, to have more dollars in their economy, they invented a new currency called the convertible currency. And basically, this is kind of a parallel peso, but that has the same value within the Cuban system as the dollar. So they had essentially three currencies. They had a U.S. dollar, the actual physical US dollars. Then they had a peso that they invented that was the same value as the dollar. And then they had the pesos that people were actually paid in that for many, many years was about 25 to 1. So it was worth less than a nickel, right? And so whenever you went to Cuba, you had to very quickly learn that one peso was worth less than a nickel, and 1 peso was worth $1. And if you screwed them up, you could really get screwed, right?
Right.
In terms of someone pulling a fast one on you, depending on which type of peso you were using. So this was basically the situation for about 20 years. Recently, the Cuban government tried to get rid of the use of the dollar, and they just had the two different pesos, right? They had their convertible peso that was pegged at the dollar, and then they had their peso. Finally, after years of delaying, because when you have these two pesos, it totally distorts the value of goods and services, of imports and exports, of salaries, and so it's really unsustainable. And so what ended up happening is, on January 1st, 2021, 13 months ago, the Cuban government announced that it was eliminating the convertible, this invented currency that they had, and just going back to their original peso, right? They called this the ordenamiento monetario, the monetary reordering, right, of the economy. And this was something that they needed to do for sure, but they did it at the most vulnerable time in the recent history of Cuba. And so what it did is it ended up leading to historic inflation over the course of the last 13 months, which is still to a large degree uncontrolled. You have the official exchange rate of that currency, and then you have the black market exchange rate, which is much more captures its true value, what people will actually buy and sell it for versus what the government declares the value is. But that basically means that the value of their internal currency, the Cuban peso, is increasingly losing its already low value. And so people then do whatever they can to hold on to, save euros or dollars, because those currencies have a value that will be there tomorrow they can count on.
Right.
So that's basically, that's a kind of a short version of their kind of experience with this monopoly.
Do the people on the ground there, is this a situation where a lot of people just want dollars, or they won't even really want to take your pesos? Because that's kind of the situation in Venezuela.
Well, they can't do that. They would probably prefer to do that, but they can't do that because, remember, the government holds a monopoly over the buying and selling of virtually all products and services, and they only accept the pesos. And so, and also they only pay people in pesos, right?
Right.
So in that sense, you have to use pesos, right? However, and this is a big however, about a year and a half ago, the government set up, for a long time, going back 25 years, the government has set up special stores that you can only use hard currency to shop in. Hard currency meaning dollars or the old peso equivalent. Even though they phased out that currency, these stores still exist. They're called MLCs, is the term they use in Cuba. Basically, they are hard currency stores. Back in the day, these were stores that were they only existed for foreigners and for diplomats to do their shopping in. They weren't really for Cubans. But nowadays, they're for Cubans, but you can only shop in them if you have access to hard currency. And generally, you can only get access to hard currency if you have relatives in Miami who literally will put money on these prepaid kind of credit card, debit cards, and that allows you to go in to these stores. But this creates, of course, a very heavy social backlash, because it creates an apartheid system where only those with access to the hard currency can shop in these stores. And often these stores are the only stores with access to key staples that people need on a day-to-day basis. And even in these stores, ironically, there are chronic scarcities. And so it's a real basket case in terms of this. Still existing in Cuba, going back from the 1960s, is a parallel economy, which is the economy of the ration booklet. There's a whole network of stores all across the country. They call them in Spanish la bodega, but they're different from the bodegas in New York City, run by Dominicans, because these are government-run stores, and they sell staples at fixed prices, and you can only shop in these stores if you have a ration booklet, and you can only buy what you are rationed in these stores. You have to buy it, but they're subsidized prices. And so most people in Cuba and their household economy, they use the ration booklet for what they can get at those ration stores at really greatly subsidized prices. But then they need a subsequent, an extra source of income, a supplementary income. And then they supplement by shopping in the dollar stores or these MLC stores so that they can piece together.
What kind of stuff are we talking about in the dollar stores?
Well, anything that's imported, so electronics, refrigerator, but also a blender, a toaster, those kind of things that are generally imported from China, just like here, they're imported from China there. But also things like, beef, things like cooking oil. Generally you can get fruits and rice and vegetable and some meats like pork and the other kinds of stores. I mean, there's a third type of market too that is like farmers markets, where farmers come from the countryside and then they sell at higher prices that are mostly market prices in these farmers markets. So you have the government stores, you have the farmers markets, and then you have the dollar stores. And so you have to kind of like navigate those three worlds in order to fill your table each day. And the prices are, they're like significantly different depending on which store you're in, or in the case of the dollar stores, in a different currency. And so it creates these real heavy chasms within the society based on who has access to these currencies, therefore who has access to these lifestyles. And it creates within a supposedly socialist country huge glaring inequalities.
Right. So right now, I read that it's basically the worst it's been since like 1993, the special period in terms of their GDP drop off. After right around that point in the early 90s, as you said, their sugar daddy, the Soviet Union, who was propping them up, collapsed, and so they were basically left on their own to flounder, and it resulted in like a huge famine. A lot of people died, a lot of malnutrition, and now apparently at this current moment, it's the worst it's been since then. So these are essentially seems like to be like the two worst times in the early 90s and right now. And I was watching, as I mentioned to you, like this Vice documentary who have been doing pretty good work on it, and they would go into these, I assume, government-run stores and also the dollar stores, and they wouldn't even have things, and the hospitals, and they wouldn't even have things like ibuprofen, even something as simple as that. They couldn't get ibuprofen or aspirin anywhere, which is just shocking beyond belief. But we're also told that they have this like amazing, I don't know, like healthcare system, and they're famous for their doctors and all that. How do you square that up? Like, are their doctors really that good? I mean, I guess relative to maybe Latin America, they have a really good doctor system. How do they compare to like Western doctors or American doctors, and what's the deal with their healthcare situation?
Well, there's a lot of glaring contradictions when you try to make sense of a place like Cuba, right? And the Cubans always joke to me. I tell them that I'm a Cubanologo. I study Cuba. They say, hey, if you figure it out, let me know, because I can't figure it out, right? The Cubans know that their system is bizarre. I think to understand Cuba, you've got to be able to hold two contradictory ideas or even realities in your head at the same time. So I think, for example, in regards to the healthcare system, while I would say that the quality of the education and healthcare that's always celebrated in Cuba is much overhyped, it is a real accomplishment of the country over the last 60 years to have prioritized those things and produced 2 or 3 generations of professionals who they can export to the world and actually do provide quality healthcare, right? But of course, that is been achieved at a very high cost in terms of just human freedom, but also their own private sector has been destroyed or collapsed. So you can have great doctors, but you might have to send those doctors abroad, or those doctors might leave the country because they can't make a living working as a doctor. So, when you kind of nationalize your economy and you kick out all the foreign supposed exploiters, right? then you have to produce everything yourself, right? And maybe you
Right.
can't produce the medical equipment or the medicine, right?
Mhm.
This is in addition to the very real impact of the embargo. The U.S. embargo on Cuba makes it more difficult or illegal to for Cuba to buy and sell things from the United States, right? They can buy food and medicine from the United States, even with the embargo, but it's very difficult to do that because there's a lot of other, let's say, red tape around those transactions. And the embargo also has what we might call extraterritorial provisions. Basically, the embargo doesn't just prevent trade between the US and Cuba, but it also sanctions and punishes third countries and third parties that do business with Cuba if they want to still do business with the US. So it has the embargo of Cuba is a unique, kind of a unique in all the world in terms of our sanctions regimes because it has that other layer that punishes third countries and third parties. With that said, the reality that the controls have produced in Cuba have ended up fracturing the society into a real unequal society with haves and have-nots. Those people who are connected to the party or to the military might have much better access to medicines and quality health care.
Or Advil.
Or Advil. Or you might have a bizarre situation
Oh.
where, yeah, there's a hospital and it's free and the doctors are really good, but you have to bring your own lunch, you have to bring your own sheets, you have to bring your own medicines, and you can't always get those things easily. So it is kind of dual surreal reality where
Mhm.
you have a great doctor but no medicine, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one to get by. It's unbelievable. This Miguel Diaz-Canel, the current president. So what's his deal? He doesn't have the Castro mystique. So it was Fidel, then his brother. Then they didn't go with somebody in the family, which is differentiates them from somebody like North Korea, which is kind of interesting. Why do you think that it didn't, or why do you think it didn't go to another family member? Was there just no one qualified? And who is this guy? And does he still have the? Do you think he still has the sort of ability to repress people, given that he doesn't have that, Castro cachet?
Well, I think one of the things that we can attribute the protest to is the fact that this new president, although he does have at his command the loyalty of the military and the repressive forces, the secret police, and the rest, he doesn't have any of the historic, let's say, legitimacy or legacy of the Castro brothers, that actually helped them to, kind of, if not get people to support them, at least get people not to oppose them, right? Because they had this historical legacy from having defeated and driven out of the country the previous dictator and achieved certain national independence and sovereignty for Cuba. And they could always point to, hey, healthcare and education, etc. This guy who's in there now, first of all, he's younger. He's in his 50s or 60s, right? And he doesn't have any of that, bearded cachet of having, fought in the mountains, right?
Hmm.
So I think that the people were much more likely to call his BS, right? Take to the
Hmm.
streets. One of the biggest chants that you'll find people online and in the street say, or spray paint even on the walls in Cuba, is Diaz-Canel Singao, which basically is calling him a fucker, right? It's kind of the good Cuban word for fucker, right? Or fuck you, right?
Yeah.
And part of that is just railing against the government, but part of that is zeroing in on him as having none of the charisma, none of the charm, and none of the ability to get people to endure any longer because he can't promise them anything in return for that, right? He's been ploddingly slow on any necessary economic reforms, and he has shut the door on any kind of political changes of any real significance. And so he doesn't really, he certainly was handpicked by the previous leadership, the Castro brothers, or the remaining living brother, Raul Castro, because they believed that he could preserve power and preserve the revolution, quote unquote. You
Hmm.
could call it also preserve the dictatorship as
Right.
it had been functioning. Um, kind of like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic so that they could still have a place to sit and rule from.
Mhm.
And he has certainly done that. And Cuba is not in any imminent danger of collapse or overthrow. But this last year has kind of taught us that all bets are off because people are fed up with there being no real response or accountability on the form of the government. Before the government could promise people tranquility, stability, and enough to eat, right? Even though they couldn't promise them civil or political freedoms, but those other promises, in addition to education and healthcare, have slowly eroded or evaporated. There's an old joke in Cuba that whenever you ask someone, what are the great triumphs or achievements of the revolution, they would say national sovereignty, healthcare, education. And then they would say, well, what are the big problems or the failings of the revolution? And they would say breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? And so now they don't even have those first three things that they've achieved, nor do they have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so that's part of the reason why people aren't putting up with it anymore, in addition to their access to digital media that lets them shout and scream so other people can hear them.
That'll get people going. Was this current president, was he the one who was responsible for the rollout of the internet and these Wi-Fi hotspots that I guess they have now in Cuba, or was it Raul Castro?
Well, he was the first vice president during that time, and so he was certainly aware of them. And he was actually initially famous or even celebrated because he was quoted as saying in one of his speeches that we can't just silence our voices or silent or shut out voices. We need to allow voices. But people thought he was talking about freedom of speech. But what he was really doing was saying we as revolutionaries need to take to the internet and to use the same propaganda on the internet that we've been using.
Right. Our version of freedom of speech. Yeah. As long as we agree with it.
So in that sense, he is certainly no change. But the fundamental change that has happened is that for either economic reasons, because the government runs the internet and therefore it makes money every time anyone tweets or sends an email or goes online, whether they're criticizing the government or not, the government is the one who's providing that service. So it's making money hand over fist, or whether it's some kind of calculated risk. In any case, starting in December of 2018 is when Cuba's kind of like a before and after date, because it was then that Cubans could buy access, monthly or constant access to internet on their cell phones.
That was 2018, you said?
December of 2018. And so since then, over the last 3 years, Cubans have had a nonstop, every couple months or every month, different kinds of marches, protests, sit-ins. Wow. And that, of course, culminated in July of 2019, although there were some significant events before that, all of which had access to the internet and alternative narration of reality and reporting on reality as a fundamental trigger. I wouldn't say any of these things were caused by the internet, but all of them were facilitated by access to social media by a broad swath of people on the island.
Do they have a great wall, a great firewall like China does? Is there anything that the government actively censors that you're aware of?
Yes, in the sense that if someone has access to the internet in Cuba, it's almost always through the government. So the government can turn the internet on and off, turn certain access to certain sites on and off, and it has done that increasingly in recent years. But it can also block specific sites or even block individuals. And so it does all of those things in different ways. But one of the things that people who study the internet and internet freedom and its impact on politics around the world have discovered is that there's this thing called the dictator's dilemma, meaning that whenever a government, authoritarian or otherwise, regulates or tries to control or shut down the internet, it's also shooting itself in the foot because the government itself needs the internet for a whole swath of other issues that aren't political or aren't controversial, healthcare, education, remittances, you name it, right? The other thing is a second part of the same thing is what I would call the Facebook effect, right? For many people around the world, Facebook is the internet, right? I mean, they might have a vague idea of what the internet is, but their experience of it is Facebook.
Right.
And countries might be able to shut down a critical website or a bunch of critical websites. But a lot of people put their content within a Trojan horse like Facebook, and a government is very, very wary of shutting off something like Facebook or Twitter itself. And so this allows people with critical versions of reality, independent reporting, denunciations, to use Facebook and Twitter and Telegram and WhatsApp and all of these platforms. They can put their content in those things instead of exclusively having their content on their own website. You know, YouTube, for example. I mean, YouTube is like it's this universal channel that everyone can access all over the world. And if you, let's say I have a friend in Cuba who has a daily morning podcast of 15 minutes, and she's always harshly critical of the government. And she lives in Havana and she does her podcast. And she puts it on like 12 different platforms. The main one is YouTube. And she does it as an audio only because Cubans have bandwidth problems. So it's an audio only YouTube channel. So she uses YouTube as her radio transmitter. And anybody who has access to YouTube has access to whatever in.
How'd she get away with that?
Well, she's very smart and she knows how to technically do it, and she has supporters outside of Cuba, but she's also kind of the Joan of Arc of Cuban bloggers and Cuban journalists. And so the government doesn't want the headache of repressing her because it would cause major international outcry. It represses lots and lots of journalists who are mostly unknown, but it doesn't want to touch her. Her name is Ioanni Sanchez.
Right. It's like the Alexei Navalny situation for a while in Russia, where he was like the biggest critic, but they left him alone for a while because it was too obvious. Right.
Well, exactly. Except that they haven't done to her what Putin did to Navalny yet.
Eventually.
But they're systematically trying to drive into exile or shut up independent journalists across the island.
So last thing, China has been able to use technology to further implement a surveillance state and in a lot of ways increase its authoritarian control over people. I'm not sure if Cuba is as competent as the CCP, who are very tech savvy. I want to see your thoughts on that. Where do you see, first of all, what do you think about that? And then where do you see this experiment going with, given the fact that there is a kind of a point of no return? They have the internet now. They're able to use it. What do you think are the probabilities that this will lead to some sort of regime change or significant changes in the next few years?
I think that the biggest problem for this movement, this internet-fueled or enabled movement to coalesce beyond something that's a spontaneous march or protest, is that one of the issues with internet-fueled protests is that it's often leaderless, and that makes it hard to repress, but it also makes it hard to replicate. You need to really have a movement. You need a dedicated, organized, hierarchically arranged group of people who are going to come up with political platforms, who are going to be able to articulate demands on the current system or provide an alternative. What we saw in July in Cuba was unprecedented, but it was only able to happen because it was unplanned. The very people who were marching didn't know the day before or maybe the hour before they were marching that they were going to be marching. It was something that happened spontaneously and virally. The same people who were involved and other leaders in civil society, journalists, artists, activists, they tried to have a second version of that in November, and it fizzled because they needed to do it in an organized way, that it would be announced, that people could do it, and it could have some kind of continuity. They had a list of demands that they were going to present to the government, and there was going to be a public showing of support for that. The government shut it down because the government knew beforehand, and they basically put all the people who were involved under house arrest, didn't let them leave their houses, and there was no march, right? And so the problem is that there is a big gulf between generalized discontent and real structures that can challenge the sitting regime. And you don't need internet to do that. You need organization. You need
leadership,
trust. You need leadership, and these and the government has been really effective at making any kind of sustained alternatives to itself very short-lived by pushing people into exile and also having a monopoly over the media so that people can't learn about other people and their organizations. And so they've eviscerated group after group after group. I wouldn't say that the future is dark. The future is certainly, I'm more optimistic than ever, but it's not going to be easy, and it's going to require organizing to take place offline as well as online.
Ted Henken, thank you so much. Where can people find you?
I'm very active on Twitter. My handle is a Cuban kind of inside joke. It's El Yuma, E-L-Y-U-M-A, which is their way of saying gringo, but kind of in an affectionate way. El Yuma, so at El Yuma. I also have a blog that's also El Yuma. And you can just go online and type my name in, Ted Henken. I'm at Baruch College at CUNY, City University of New York.
Excellent. And we'll put the links to that in the podcast notes. Thanks so much. If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.